Warning, the following podcast is intended for mature audiences only. Listener discretion is advised. If you are sensitive to any content or subject matter in films, I recommend looking up this film on doesthedogdie.com. It is a user-based database of extensive content warnings for pretty much every film you can think of. It basically gives you a heads up to all the potentially triggering topics a movie might have. Check it out and take care of yourself. Welcome back to We Creeps. I'm your host, Evan Exhumed, and just like before, every week I summarize and review a different horror film for people who are a little too squeamish or easily spooked to watch them, but still really enjoy the plot and often end up looking them up on Wikipedia or Googling the ending explained. We, of course, welcome horror movie fans all the same. Even the ones that don't like Ari Aster, I still, for the most part, like you. Speaking of which, today I will be attempting to give you a summary of the 2023 new Ari Aster film, Beau Is Afraid, which is written and directed by Ari Aster. It stars quite a cast, including Joaquin Phoenix, Patti LuPone, Amy Ryan, Parker Posey, Nathan Lane, and a few others. I have to say that despite being 3 hours long, this is probably my favorite horror film of 2023 thus far. I feel that it has so much to say about generational trauma, Judaism, which I believe Ari Aster described this film as a Jewish Lord of the Rings, and Nathan Lane called it a Jewish Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is fantastic. So I will be talking about this film and exploring a little bit of those themes more than I would maybe any other episodes, just because I love it so much. And it's already going to be a long episode anyway, because it's a 3-hour film. So buckle up and we'll really dive into this. And I will say that, even though it's a 3-hour film, I've seen this movie now 4 times. It's just, I don't know, there's just something really about it that made me just keep coming back to it. And even though it is going to be a longer episode, I really just still wanted to do it, despite, having other shorter movies I definitely could have done instead. So with all that said, let's go ahead and start on this 2023 drama horror, Beau Is Afraid. The film immediately begins with Beau being born. We see the darkness of the womb. He is not screaming, he's not crying or anything, and we can hear his mother panicking and the nurses are trying to calm her down. And then he comes out and they spank the baby a little bit and he begins to scream. Immediately, we then jump to Beau's therapist. He sits down and one of the first things that he mentions is how he is really afraid that he might die because he accidentally swallowed some mouthwash a couple of times. So this sort of introduces the character as being very anxious and paranoid, which is very accurate for how he behaves for essentially the rest of the film. So, they're immediately setting that foundation for us. Beau mentions a reoccurring dream or nightmare that he keeps having that involves his mom, but the therapist puts him back on track and sort of asks him how he feels about visiting his mother. And he seems to, sort of be beating around the bush that he doesn't really want to see her. And we can kind of tell that there's a strained relationship between Beau and his mother. And so the therapy session ends with the therapist writing him a new prescription. And the therapist makes it very clear that he's not supposed to take it without water. So, of course, this is going to come up later. So as Beau is walking home, we sort of get an idea of what the world is like for him. There's a lot of people running around, screaming, very chaotic. He ends up getting his mom a little angel statue with a baby, and as he's buying this, there is a man about to jump from a very large building, very tall building, and he's like, what's going on? And everyone seems to be wanting this person to jump off. So I will say this whole movie is basically an anxiety fever dream. So a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be telling you is, even though it's literally happening in the movie, to me it feels like most of this movie is sort of like a metaphor. And a lot of the things that are happening are just sort of exaggerated versions of what a very anxious person might be experiencing. I do think that for the sake of the film itself, these are things that are happening to Beau. And when you're watching them, it is literally happening. But again, like the whole film is just sort of commentary and, metaphors. But I just wanted to sort of outline that for what's about to happen. We then do a little time skip and see that the man had jumped, I believe, or there's just another dead body there that looks pretty fucked up. And it's nighttime now, so Beau's heading home from his therapist and coming out of a taxi. And I mean, there's just chaos on the streets. I think it's supposed to be New York. And there's just people dancing. There's loud music. There's naked people running around. There's guys running around with knives. It is a complete nightmare. We then suddenly see Beau sprinting through the street and running into his apartment, which has a locked door. And as he gets inside of it, there's also someone chasing him and trying to get in as well. But thankfully, he makes it in. But it really is just kind of going to show what a bad area he lives in. So he unwinds from the day, writes a little message on the gift that he got his mother saying, happy anniversary to the day that dad died, I guess. And so he goes to sleep. Before he does that, he does put the ceramic in a drawer, and we see a picture of a young girl, probably about 12 or 13, and it looks like this was someone that Beau knew in his childhood, and her name is Elaine, so she will come up later. As he's sleeping, he keeps getting notes under his door that says, turn the music down, and we as the audience know that Beau is not playing anything. He's completely silent, and over the course of the night, he keeps getting more and more little notes, getting kind of more erratic and angry that he hasn't turned the music down. And eventually the person, his neighbor, I assume, starts blasting their own music in retaliation. So, another example of just like a sort of an anxiety nightmare where you're being blamed for something that you're not doing at all. So this causes him to oversleep and, he's going to be late for his flight to visit his mother. So he quickly packs everything that he can and he heads out the door, but he forgets his dental floss. So he sets his bag and his keys still in the door and quickly runs inside to grab it. And not even a minute later, his bag and his keys are missing. The janitor walks by him and says, "You're fucked, buddy," which again is like, this is a nightmare realm. And so he ends up calling his mom, who is like basically just sort of guilting him and making him feel like shit for losing his keys, and which caused him to miss his flight. So she's like, "Oh, you don't even have to worry about visiting me. I'm sorry if it's so much trouble." Kind of doing the like, "Oh, it's fine, don't worry," but just kind of sort of passive aggressive towards him, and he sort of begins to panic about this. So he quickly goes to grab his new medication and just pop that pill, but unfortunately he has run out of water. So he tries to get some from the sink. He tries to find bottles of water, but there's no water to be found. So Beau is going to have to go to the little convenience store to grab a bottle of water in the very dangerous city that he lives in. He goes to the front door of the apartment complex and leaves a phone booth in between the door because he doesn't have his keys anymore. And he sprints all the way to the convenience store, dodging people screaming at him. One guy starts running up to him going, "Can you help me? Can you help me? Can you help me?" And he finally makes it to the convenience store and starts drinking the water. But then when he goes to pay for it, his credit card is declined. He has the cash, but it's a lot of it is in change. And as he's doing this, literally everyone on the street starts to go into his apartment. Like they go into the apartment complex, just hordes of people, all these different, naked people, houseless people, just literally everyone on the street. So he quickly pays the convenience store person who's also talking shit to him, and he sprints over to try to get into his house to stop these people. And one person just rips the phone book from the door, and now Beau is trapped outside of his apartment complex with no keys. He ends up staying outside the entire night as the people in his apartment are essentially just destroying the entire thing. He sits on top of one of those like construction beam type things, the ones where they kind of set up when they're working on the side of a building, and he just ends up sleeping there the whole night. When he wakes up, everyone seems to have left, so he goes back down, and the door to the apartment complex has been completely broken, so he just steps through that and heads up to his apartment. And again, the whole place is just completely fucking trash. There's even a dead body right outside of his door. A man was bitten by a brown recluse, which there have been posters throughout his entire apartment complex warning about this. So, and brown recluses, if you don't know, are very deadly spiders and they can really fuck you up. So he begins to draw a bath and then tries to rebook his plane tickets, but unfortunately his credit card is declined. I think his mom pays for his credit card, so I think maybe that's why they stopped working. It's a little detail I noticed after my fourth watch. But yeah, so they stopped working and he's just kind of panicking about that. So he calls his mom, and through a UPS guy, he finds out that his mother has died and she had a chandelier fall on her head and decapitate her, I guess. So, that's pretty upsetting for Beau. So he ends up going and taking his bath. And as he's taking a bath, we see that his testicles are like the size of grapefruit, which will come into play later. So as he's taking this bath, trying to relax, he notices a man is just Spider-Man'd up on the ceiling. And they just kind of stare at each other for a minute. And the man falls and they sort of struggle in the bath. Beau is trying to fight this guy off. I don't really know if he's really attacking him, but it's just, they're kind of wrestling a little bit. And this causes Beau to panic and jump out of the tub. And he just sprints out of his apartment completely naked, stepping on all the glass that was shattered in the front apartment complex door, and just tries to get away from this guy. He ends up encountering a man with like a knife or some sort of ice pick or something who's naked. He then begins to chase Beau, and Beau runs to a policeman who then points a gun at him, telling him to drop whatever he has, which is the little angel statue, I guess. And, Beau ends up running away from the policeman who's about to shoot him, and then he gets hit by a huge van and then passes out. We then see Beau dreaming the dream that he referenced earlier with his therapist. He's sitting in a bathtub as a child while his young mother yells at another child who looks pretty much exactly like him. She just starts squawking at him like a bird, and then he ends up waking up in this like 15-year-old girl's room, just in a hospital gown, hooked up to an IV, and he has now a ankle bracelet on him. He was also stabbed a bunch by that guy who had been chasing him after he had been hit by the car. But thankfully, we meet the two characters, Grace and Roger. They're a married couple. Roger is a surgeon, so he took care of Beau. Grace, is one of the people who volunteers to give people food, houseless people and stuff on the street. So she hit him with that large van. And yeah, so they're just yep, we just took care of you. We didn't take you to a hospital. You've just been in a coma for 2 days. And, we just been keeping a close eye on you. And, of course, Grace apologizes for hitting him with the car. But it's a very strange situation, just, like the entirety of this movie. So they end up having lunch or dinner or something, and we also get introduced to their daughter, Tony. She seems to be really upset that Beau is sleeping in her room, but insists that he stay there, but she's just really fucking mad about it. And we learn of a character named Nate, who was their son, who died in some sort of war. And then we also meet Jeeves, who was Nate's buddy in the army or something. He has severe PTSD and is mad dogging Beau the entire time. So after dinner, they go outside and he just kind of rests and ends up trying to call his mother or anyone really related to his mother. And he ends up calling his mother's attorney, or that's the person who picks up anyway. And he basically just gives him a huge guilt trip that he needs to get there. For the reference, Beau is Jewish, and with traditional Jewish funerals, you're supposed to bury the body as soon as possible. Doesn't matter who can make it. The body is supposed to get into the ground basically the next day. And because of this, and because of Beau taking forever to get there, they're not burying the body because her last wish was to make sure that Beau was there. So the attorney gives him a ton of grief about it and just is get your ass over here, wear a nice suit, you're so selfish, and just kind of the meanest things that he could say to Beau. So he ends up asking Roger and Grace if he can get a ride from them or they can take him to the airport. And they tell him, well, just because of all your stitches and stuff, you're not going to be able to go on a plane due to the pressurization of the cabin. So they're we'll take you in a day or two once you're feeling a little bit better. And even though Beau is internally freaking out about this, he just sort of, accepts that this is kind of what he has to do, that he's kind of at their mercy here. So some hours pass and he goes into the bedroom and they have made him hand embroidered little name tag pajamas that say Beau on it. And you can actually buy these pajamas on a24.com, which is kind of great. I almost bought them, but they didn't have my size, so I was a little sad about that. So after he gets done changing, he goes back to the couch and he sees that the daughter, Tony, is there, and she's just eating pills and just snacks and just staring at him. And she's just shut up and get into my bed. And Beau is really trying to be friendly about this. He's it's fine. I can sleep on the couch. You can take your room back. It's no problem. And she's just shut the fuck up and get into my bed. And it's just, everything is just so weird in this movie, especially the characters, but there's just a ton of hostility coming from, the daughter character. The daughter, Tony, goes up to Jeeves, the PTSD guy that's living with Grace and Roger, and begins to shout things and like point at Beau through like the window. So we can kind of get an idea that Tony is just talking shit and saying just really negative things to this very unstable PTSD survivor. So the next morning, when they're all having breakfast, Jeeves is just staring through the window at Beau, looking like he's going to fucking murder him. So the daughter and this PTSD survivor guy just do not seem to like Beau, and it's making Beau pretty uncomfortable. But anyway, at breakfast, Roger tells Beau that he got called in for an emergency surgery with one of his oldest patients, and he's not going to be able to take Beau to his mother today again, and that, hopefully he gets the surgery done in time, but he'll be able to take him tomorrow morning. Beau is just like, wait a minute, I need to go. And they're like, nope, not in your condition. And so both Roger and Grace leave. At one point, Grace leaves him a little note that says, stop incriminating yourself, which I'm not really 100% sure what that means for the movie. And I've seen this movie quite a few times, but he ends up trying to call the attorney, but nobody answers. So he ends up going on Tony's computer, the daughter, to look up stuff about his mom. We learn that his mother was a very, very prolific CEO, and we see some interviews, and one of the people that is interviewed is actually Elaine, who was the girl, that little photo that was in Beau's side table that I referenced earlier that would come up later. And so once he sees her, he just projectile vomits onto the laptop, and the daughter, Tony, comes in and is like, what the fuck are you doing vomiting on my fucking laptop? And she gets very angry about this, obviously, and Beau is freaking out, very sorry, and so she tells him to get the fuck in the van and that she's going to be personally taking him home, but I don't really trust her. So she and her friend are there, and they start driving in circles, smoking some sort of joint that has 3 different drugs in it, they say, and she says that she's going to tell everyone that Beau touched her or got inappropriate with her unless he smokes the joint. So they force him to get high as shit, and they just sort of make fun of him and just drive in circles, and then Beau starts to trip a little bit. We then flash back to when Beau was probably about 11 or 12, and this is where we're going to meet Elaine and see a little bit more about his relationship with his mother growing up. Beau and his mother are on a cruise, and they're just sort of chilling by the pool, and that's where Beau first sees Elaine. His mother asks about how he feels about their housekeeper, Martha, and he's like, oh yeah, I love Martha. And she's like, you love her? And she's like, and he's like, yeah, I like her. And so we can kind of see that his mother is almost a little bit jealous that he says that about the housekeeper, and how he changes his answer to sort of appease her. Later, Beau is just reading something in the hotel room or the cruise room or whatever, and Elaine starts banging on all the doors and is like, there's a dead body in the pool, there's a dead body in the pool. And so Beau ends up going with her to the pool to stare at the dead body, and they sort of introduce each other and kind of talk about their parents a little bit. We then cut to Mona, Beau's mom, talking to him about Elaine a little bit, and she just almost just seems kind of jealous. She's kind of asking him about her, and he's like, do you like her? Is that your type? And there's scenes of them laying in bed together, and her being like, you could find a woman like that. Those women who are confident like that need a man who's confident too. And, I think that you're the right man, and all of this weird, just like very emotionally incestuous stuff. And during these scenes, we also see Beau in real time back in the present, and he's sort of still high. He ends up wandering back into the house after the girls leave him in the car. And, everything is just sort of faded and muffled because he's just high off his ass. Back in the past, Beau ends up sneaking out with Elaine at night. They share a little bit of a conversation and end up kissing. And Beau wakes up in present time, asleep on the couch, which really upsets Tony. And she screams at him. He falls back asleep a little bit and is woken up by Elaine in the past in his little bedroom hotel thing on the ship, and he's told that her mother is taking her away. I guess Elaine's mom is just really psychotic. There's really no explanation for why she's like this, but she tells Beau, hey, I want you to wait forever for me. I want you to wait for me. I'll come back. And, obviously that never really happens, but that's something that really sticks with Beau. and makes a lot more sense as to why he has that photo in present day in his nightstand that he's always kept. So his weird trip nightmare ends with being woken up by Jeeves, the crazy PTSD guy, coming at him, and Roger ends up tackling him and putting like 3 different sedatives into him. And he's like, "Don't worry, Beau. Like, he's just, having a PTSD flashback. It's totally fine." And Beau is just in the corner, sort of, just staring at this whole thing going down. And it's a lot. So he just ends up, I guess, falling asleep in the corner or staying there so long that it's now daytime. Grace, the mom, the woman who hit him with her truck, ends up talking to him a little bit, and she tells him to check channel 76. And when he does, he actually sees a recording of events that are actually going to take place for the rest of the movie. So he's like looking into the future of all the terrible things that will eventually happen in this film. But, if you're watching the movie for the first time, you have no idea what any of this means. But having watched it a few times, all that stuff does happen in the movie. Suddenly, Tony, the daughter, comes up and starts screaming at Beau to get in the son's room. Nate, the one who died that they referenced earlier, and she has like a paint bucket, and she tells him that this is where he's going to be staying now, and to help him or to help her paint. And she begins screaming at him to help, and he's just like, I don't know what the fuck's going on with you. And suddenly she starts to chug paint, which, chugging paint obviously is not very good for you. So I think she dies. And the mother, Grace, comes in and, tries to resuscitate her and blames Beau for what just happened. And she starts to scream at him, throw him into the wall, and Beau just jumps through the glass door and begins sprinting into the forest behind their house. And as he's doing this, Grace screams for Jeeves, the PTSD guy, to kill him, rip him apart, and destroy him for causing the death of Tony, her daughter. So Beau is fleeing at this point from this insane family. Beau ends up hitting a low-hanging tree and passes out, and we see another part of that dream that he keeps having where his mother is closing up an attic after having just placed something up in it. So he wakes up and then begins to wander the forest a little bit, and he encounters a pregnant woman in sort of like medieval clothing, kind of Renaissance fair stuff. And she tells him that she's part of a traveling theater group who like sets up in forests, hangs out, does some work, and then they show some sort of play or something, and then they sort of move on. So they invite Beau to watch the play. They actually end up giving him some new clothes. Everybody's really nice to him. While this is all happening and he's sitting down to watch the play, we see sort of this like older, thin man sort of watching him from the background. And we also cut to Jeeves, the PTSD dude, sort of sprinting with full body gear, like weapons, knives, grenades, and everything, like in the forest looking for Beau. So there's that little bit of tension in the background. The play begins, and first it starts off with just like a normal person, and then it slowly transforms into Beau, who is now the person in the play. We see this man break some shackles that he was tied to, which I think, in my opinion, what we're about to talk about and see is Beau imagining a life where he had sort of broken the shackles of his anxiety, his depression, and his mother. And what we see now is really cool, actually. The whole scene, everything in the background is sort of drawn and made with like play materials. Beau is also sort of dressed as a very casual farmer. He's wearing suspenders, jeans, a little, farmer hat. And he kind of goes on this journey, and he ends up meeting a woman after he settles down in like a random town and becomes kind of a blacksmith. He has children with her. And unfortunately, there is a huge storm that washes him and his children away. And the whole scene sort of is, it's a pretty long scene. It's about 30 minutes probably. And we see him, age over time looking for his family. And I won't go too deep into it, but there are a lot of really interesting metaphors for the way that the Jews were treated throughout history. There's a narrator who's narrating all the things that's happening to Beau while he's lost and looking for his family. And many of the descriptions align with how Jews were treated and sort of nomadic for a period. And it's really interesting. There's even one part where it says that, you will not speak the language of the people around you, and they will all blame you for their problems, and they will imprison you, and they will hunt you, and they will send their dogs after you. And the dogs that they send after Beau during this whole, weird artsy montage are German Shepherds. Finally, we see that Beau has aged significantly. I mean, he's now a man in his 70s in this whole play, and he stumbles across a town, and the town is having a play. And so he spends his last dollar on that play and sees that the play is within a play. So the person in the play within a play is narrating everything that's happened to Beau inside the play. I know this is a very confusing sentence, but it's just sort of like two layers of play. And the people on the stage are his three sons. And so they approach him recognizing that it's their father, and he begins to cry, and he's like, "Oh, my sweet boys, I found you." And they ask him, they said, "We've looked for you for so many years. Where is mom? Do we have any other family?" And I guess the mom, the wife that Beau married in this fantasy, died in the storm that washed them away and separated them. And he then begins to talk about their grandmother, Mona, his mother, and some of the things that she had said to him. And we learn about Beau's father and why he's never really discussed. It turns out that when Beau was conceived, his father had a heart attack while they were having sex. He had never had sex before until he had sex with Beau's mother. And so Beau's mother, Mona, tells Beau, "It's a genetic condition. All of your grandfathers before your father died the same way. If you ever have sex, you will have a heart attack and die." And so this is sort of the explanation for why Beau has never had sex, why his testicles are so enlarged, and why he's never really had a relationship. And so we jump back to him having the conversation with his three sons, and the three sons look at him and go, "Wait a minute, if you've never had sex before, how do we exist?" And this is sort of what snaps Beau back into reality. He's now back at the play that he originally was at before he started tripping and started fantasizing about the life that he could have had. And the pregnant woman is asking him if he's okay. And he hands her the statue that he was going to give his mom, the little trinket. And she's like, "Are you sure you want this?" And he's like, "Yeah, I want you to have it." And so then the strange man, the skinny man that I had mentioned earlier, who was sort of stalking him in the background, approaches him and begins to talk to him. And he says that he knew his father and that his father is not actually dead and that his mother lied about that. And Beau begins to sort of suspect that this man is actually not just a random man who knew his father, but actually his father. And unfortunately, it's never really confirmed, but part of me wants to believe that this is actually his father. I don't know why he randomly shows up all of a sudden, but I kind of want to believe that it is. The man who might be Beau's father ends up running away, and one of the stage play people ends up getting a knife thrown in his chest. One of the other stagehand people pulls a gun from his inventory or something and begins to look for who threw the knife. And then suddenly Beau's potential father is like, "Beau, run!" And you see a grenade get thrown at him and explodes a bunch of people in the crowd. And there's just complete chaos. Jeeves, the soldier PTSD dude, comes running in, trying to kill Beau. There's complete chaos, and Beau is just running, dodging bullets, trying to make it out of there alive. And Jeeves uses an app on his phone to cause the tracker that was on Beau's leg, the one that the Dr. Roger put on him when he first woke up way back when. And I guess it causes him, shocks him and knocks him out. So Beau passes out once again. Beau then has the same dream that he's had before, the one where his mother does something with the attic. But in this one, he is in a bath and his mother is yelling at what looks like another younger version of himself. Some people think that it's like a twin or like a sibling, but in my personal opinion, this is Beau's courage. This is Beau defending himself, because the one that Beau is looking at from the bathtub, the one that's yelling at his mother, is, that's courage. That's standing up to an abusive mother, emotionally incestuous mother. And so we watch that little boy get thrown up into the attic, and then the mother sort of comes at Beau and in his dream, and he wakes up in the forest, totally fine, I guess, just a little zonk. And he ends up hitchhiking and getting a ride to his mother's funeral/house. However, when he gets there, it looks like they're shutting everything down. The catering company or van called Shiva Steve's. And if you're not familiar, Shiva is typically the mourning period after somebody in your family dies. And if you're Jewish, it's like a multi-day mourning period thing. And yeah, they're packing up chairs, they're packing up food, whatever. And Beau sort of just kind of slowly stumbles into his mother's house. Beau enters the house. There's some videos going about his mother, how she was like a single mother, entrepreneur, CEO. We also see an open casket, which is not super common, if done at all, for Jewish funerals. But yeah, so there's her body just in the casket without a head because the chandelier broke. And you can also see, for a quick scene, the chandelier, the chain, how it's broken is very similar to the way that Beau broke the chains earlier in the play to sort of free himself. So that's definitely, in my opinion, some symbolism there done on purpose by Ari. Ari Aster, I gotta say, in all of the movies and films that I've seen that he's done, which are 4, he is just so dedicated to attention to detail. And it was one of the things I love about his movies. So Beau hangs out in the house. Everybody's kind of gone. The people are cleaning up. And he looks through some of the photos that are on the wall. There's actually a timeline of all the different products and stuff that his mother came up with, the business that she ran. And we can see in all these different photos that Beau is actually the person in all the advertisements, when he's a little baby, all the way up to being a teen. So it's kind of interesting to see just how much his mother really used him for all of these different advertisements and stuff. And this kind of lends more to the idea that he was probably taken care of by his mother, and the actual housing unit that he lived in the really bad area at the very beginning of the movie was actually owned by his mother. It was a sort of like rehabilitation houses. So that sort of, I guess, explains all the crime. Not to that extreme extent, but still, why it is the way that it is. After Beau finishes looking at everything, he ends up taking a nap, and maybe 3 or 4 hours go by. And a woman comes, she's very late, and it appears to be Elaine. And he approaches her and he's like, Elaine? And she's like, Beau? And they sort of rekindle and talk a little bit. Turns out she did actually work for Mona, which is, kind of interesting. Beau then looks at Elaine and he tells her, I waited for you. And she's like, what? Why did you wait for me? And he says, you told me to. And she's like, oh my gosh, like, do you want me to stay? Do you want me to go? And Beau just kisses her. And this really sweet moment. It put a really big smile on my face. And, Nina Simone is playing in the background of this. It's just a very tender moment. So they go inside and they look for a bedroom, and they end up going into Beau's mother's bedroom. And he goes and gets cleaned up in the bathroom and comes out. And Elaine is in the bed, ready to get jiggy with it. So they start making out, and she puts on Mariah Carey's Always Be My Baby. And the sex scene is pretty funny because, this movie has been very weird and serious. And to hear that song being played is quite the juxtaposition. And so she begins to ride him. And Beau, having never had a sexual experience before, ejaculates almost immediately. And apparently breaks the condom because he ejaculated so much and so hard. And they continue to have sex, and Beau is like laughing and enjoying himself. And she has an orgasm, and she unfortunately dies mid-orgasm. And while, we did have a happy moment there, thinking that Beau survived having sex because, his mother said that he would have a heart attack, it turns out that Elaine ended up having a heart attack in a sort of, cruel, ironic twist of fate here. Then all of a fucking sudden, we hear Mona, Beau's mom, start talking some shit. And she's like, well, that's nice. And it turns out that Mona actually faked her death, and she didn't actually die. And she had been watching Beau and Elaine fuck the entire time. And 2 of her servants just pick up Elaine's already rigor mortis body and take it away. Beau's mother begins to guilt him needlessly, endlessly, telling him she can't believe that he would do this to her. I mean, just all of these terrible, really just selfish, narcissistic things that this type of mother that maybe you're familiar with would say to him. And he tells her that he didn't actually think that she was dead. And she's like, that's bullshit. I saw your face. You totally thought I was dead. And it turns out that he recognized on the hand of the headless body that we saw earlier that it was Martha, his nanny growing up, who had the same birthmark on her hands. However, he confronts Mona about this, and she reveals that the housekeeper nanny volunteered to die in order to pull this fucking crazy scheme on Beau. And Mona, in exchange, essentially paid off her entire family and her extended family so that they would never have to work again. So she gave them millions of dollars in order for this to happen. She then goes on another little tirade about how, despite being so passive in his life, he's still to blame for all the bad things in his life because he just let them happen to him. And we also learn that she had paid or hired Beau's therapist and essentially got recordings of every single session that he ever had, hundreds of recordings, all given to her. And this just totally shocks Beau. His therapist actually comes out of the bathroom and just sits down and smiles and stares at him while his mother begins to play back sessions that were recorded. He begins to shout at her, telling her that, he knows that his father's alive. Why would she do this to him? And she asks him, oh, you really want the truth? I'll show you the truth. And so she leads him through the house to that attic that we've seen in those reoccurring dreams. And Beau goes into the attic and is shut into it. His mother also tells him that it wasn't a dream, but a memory. And so I'm not really clear as to how it was a memory because he doesn't have a brother. But he ends up going into the attic. And inside the attic, he sees a emaciated version of himself, chained up in the same clothes that he saw that little boy wearing years and years ago. And then he turns and also sees yes, I'm being serious, giant penis monster with like weird praying mantis arms. And then suddenly Jeeves, the PTSD guy, breaks through the attic window and begins to stab the penis monster in the testicles. And then the penis monster goes ahead and stabs him in the head with one of its like praying mantis arm things. And Beau quickly runs out of the attic and falls down the ladder and is just panicking and screaming and holding on to his mother's leg and just, saying, I'm sorry, it's sorry, I don't want to see this. She also claims that the giant penis monster was his father. And she transitions from comforting Beau to then just totally shitting on him, saying that he promised that he would never hurt her, but all of his promises are full of shit. And just like, again, really, really emotionally incestuous stuff. And finally, she's like, you know what? I think I figured it out. I hate you. And as she's saying that she hates him, he just snaps and just starts to strangle her. Even though he does strangle her really hard, he does eventually stop. But at that point, he has crushed her windpipe and she collapses and falls onto a glass table. And so Beau just ends up leaving the house and his face is just completely ajar. And he just walks across the large yard and he ends up at a beach with a little boat with like a single little motor. And he gets into it and he begins to sail off into the night. And we can see stars, overhead. And he pilots his boat to a cave of some sorts, a canal. And he goes through the hole and ends up in this very large aquarium stadium type thing, like the kind of thing that they have at SeaWorld, and he's just in the very center. And suddenly a spotlight goes on him, and we can see that there are tons of people in the stadium just surrounding him. And then the lawyer of Mona's, the one who chewed him out earlier in the film, is present. And essentially the lawyer and Mona standing there sort of read off all of the terrible things that Beau has done, at least in Mona's eyes. And Beau is just sort of stuck in this boat, just having to listen to this thing. And he tries to talk back and, but he still has to just sort of face these things that his mother seems to think that are huge sins that he's committed. And, I would say that his greatest crime was just never sticking up for himself. But we watch him kind of have this back and forth between the lawyer and his mother. And as this is happening, the boat's motor begins to fail, and the boat that he's on begins to sink, and he seems to not be able to move his legs, and he struggles quite a bit to get out of the boat. But eventually he goes from panicking to just simply accepting that this is the way that he's going to die. And suddenly the boat motor explodes and flips the boat over, and we watch, and hear sounds of Beau drowning, and the film just sort of ends after he drowns. And we can see that the crowd of people are slowly leaving as the credits are going, similar to how people were slowly leaving the theater at this point, if you did see it in theaters. Also, Mona is sort of sobbing and screaming for her child because he's died. And that's just kind of how the movie ends, which is very weird. But I will talk about a little bit what I think it means and how I feel about it. So I think one of the things to really consider about this movie is that it's all very metaphorical. But from my opinion, and based on, Ari Aster being Jewish and saying that this movie is extremely Jewish and has a lot of Jewish themes, what I really feel like this movie is showing us is sort of the experience that Beau is having in purgatory, in Jewish purgatory. And for those who don't know, Jewish purgatory is typically a place that you spend before you ascend in the afterlife. It is a place where you kind of think about your life and go over it and atone and just sort of have that dialogue with yourself. And so what I think we're experiencing is sort of Beau going through his life, thinking through all of his anxieties, and that's why we're seeing them in the most dramatic and extreme ways. We also see the life that Beau could have lived if he had not lived his life in fear, which is, the whole play thing that we talked about toward the middle of the movie. And, facing his mother, facing Elaine, all of these different things that we see that's happening to Beau. These are just sort of him recounting the mistakes and decisions that he's made in his life and how things could have been, and just sort of coming to terms with them. I think the emaciated version that he found in the attic was, part of his courage that his mother took away. The part of him that stood up to her was locked away into that attic. The giant penis monster is a metaphor for not only his father, but his sexuality that was put away by his mother. The reason that it symbolizes both his father and his sexuality is because his mother made it clear that his father was to blame for him having those genetics that caused him to never be able to have sex. So to me, that's why it's put together. And then finally with the, stadium at the very end, this is sort of his final processing and judgment before he moves on to the next stage of life. And there is a metaphor there in how he dies, because at the very beginning of the movie, if you remember, he was born into this world. We saw his birth. We saw him struggling to breathe. And then the way that he dies is he drowns. And, the canal that he enters is very, similar to that of a womb. So he sort of exits the womb in the beginning of the movie and then re-enters it at the end. So there's a lot to unpack about this movie, but those are sort of the main things that I gotta take away from it. So that was Beau Is Afraid by Ari Aster, 2023 horror drama film. Thanks so much for listening. Don't forget, you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr. You can also support the podcast by buying some merch from TeePublic, or supporting me directly by subscribing to my Patreon. I have multiple different tiers for whatever you can afford, but that's the spiel. So thanks again for listening, and I hope to see you again next week. And I also hope that you don't forget to stay spooky out there.